Steve Olsen is currently serving as the Associate Managing Director for the Family and Church History Department. He has worked for Church History his entire professional career, most recently as Acting Director, Museum of Church History and Art. In his current position, he oversees the operations and provides leadership for the Church History Library, Church Archives, Museum of Church History and Art, and Church Historic Sites. He is also an adjunct professor of anthropology at Brigham Young University. Service to the wider profession has included terms as president of the Utah Museums Association and Western Museums Association, and on the boards of the Charles Redd Center for Western States, Utah State Office of Museum Services, and the National Alliances of State Museums Associations. He has published widely in the fields of museum studies and church history, and frequently presents at scholarly and professional association conferences. He has a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University and a master's and a doctorate degree in anthropology from the University of Chicago. He and his wife Kathy have 5 children. He served a mission to France and has held numerous ward and state callings, including bishop, high counselor, and gospel doctrine teacher. Let me mention, he will speak. We'll have volunteers with cards that they'll pass out, so if you have questions, just fill out your questions on the cards. Then we'll have volunteers go up and down the aisles, collect your questions, and he'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, we're pleased to welcome Brother Stephen Olsen as our first speaker.
Scott, thank you very much. I've prepared my remarks with adequate time to answer questions or engage in discussion. So please feel free to raise any questions, challenge any of the assertions that I make, or engage in a number of other issues that I hope will be generated from my prepared remarks. There's a widespread public perception that the church archives is closed. At a point in the distant past, this rumor was true. This is actually a sign that was outside the church library when it was located in the administration building at 47 East South Temple. But fortunately, since that time, things have changed. In what follows, I consider 4 variations of this question in order to examine the nuances of the public perception. I will then summarize several initiatives of the Church History Department that address these and other concerns. Question number 1, is the public allowed in the church archives? The reading rooms of the Church History Department in the east wing of the church office building are open to the public from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Monday through Friday, except certain official holidays. This schedule corresponds with the hours that the church office building is generally open to the public. In addition, various historical databases can be accessed at any time at lds.org and josephsmith.net. As a record of our public service in 2006, nearly 50,000 archival items were circulated to more than 13,000 patrons, consisting largely of family historians, church headquarters personnel, and academic scholars. During the same time, our modest online databases received about 1 million hits. While the number of the visitors to the reading rooms in the church office building is not unusual for comparable research libraries, the disparity between on-site and online visitors suggests the potential of our serving in the future a much greater audience through the internet. Question number 2, are the collections of the Church History Department accessible? This question refers not to the location of the holdings or the hours of operation, but whether the collections themselves can be examined by the public. In order to address this issue effectively, we must first understand that virtually all collecting institutions restrict access to their collections to some degree. The level of restriction generally varies by type of institution. Collections in public libraries tend to be the most accessible, followed by those in special collections and academic research libraries. Private and corporate archives generally adopt the most restrictive access policies, and museums, for the most part, allow access only to their collections on public display. Because the church archives is more like a private or corporate archives, its collections are more restricted than those of a public or special collections library. However, the church archives makes a remarkable number of its records accessible to the public. In an effort to clarify its collections access policies, more than a decade ago, the Church History Department Administration clarified the criteria and procedure for gaining access to historical records. By policy, collections are publicly accessible unless they have sacred, private, or confidential contents. Let me explain briefly these criteria. Sacred. Like all religions that have a strong commitment to preserving their sacred beliefs and practices, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is obligated by sacred covenant to keep certain materials holy, particularly those associated with the temple. Private. Privacy is a legal category, and it recognizes that certain kinds of personal information, including health history, cannot be publicly divulged without the permission of the living individual to whom that information is associated. Confidential. Confidential records are those that relate to executive or proprietary church-related matters, such as minutes of presiding councils and proceedings of disciplinary actions. A formal review process assigns a level of access restriction to holdings that have sacred, private, or confidential contents. However, just because a record is restricted does not mean that access is impossible. Some restricted records may be accessed with the permission of authorized department personnel. So SPC policies and practices are periodically reviewed for clarity, consistency, and alignment. Question number 3, is the experience of visitors to the church archives productive and enjoyable? Visitor experiences at the church archives greatly influence their perception of its openness. So openness is not simply a factual matter, but it's an emotional quality as well. And it has been our perception that those who are the most critical of the church archives have never been there. By contrast, many visitors, and that includes many of you, have had rewarding experiences regarding its holdings. Effective finding aids, helpful user interfaces, a welcome setting, and even the secure environment of the reading rooms communicate a sense of permanence, protection, professionalism, and importance. Nevertheless, we recognize the need constantly to improve our performance in this area, particularly for interested patrons from throughout the world who will likely never visit Salt Lake City or church headquarters. Therefore, the experience of our online patrons must be as rewarding as that of our on-site visitors. Question number 4, are the holdings of the church archives relevant? Collecting institutions like the Church History Department may be open to the public at convenient hours and have liberal access policies and attractive public service programs, and yet not be compelling because few patrons care about the contents of their collections. This is the case with many special collections libraries or private archives whose collections are so arcane or narrowly defined as to be irrelevant to most ordinary people. Concern that archival collections of the church are not relevant to abiding public interests is the least of the 4 concerns I've addressed here. The comparable popularity of church history websites, suggests that the relevance of the collections is far less of a public concern than are the convenience of the library and accessibility of the collections. However, as the church continues to spread throughout the world, the Church History Department faces an ever more daunting challenge to represent in its collections the church's growing size, complexity, and significance. From the perspective, then, of these four discussion points, we could answer the question, is the church archives closed, with a resounding no. It is open, its collections are remarkably accessible and relevant to a wide range of research interests, and the experience of visitors is quite positive. At the same time, the Church History Department recognizes that much more must be done in order to improve its service to the worldwide church in the 21st century. In the time remaining, I will summarize 6 related initiatives by which the Church History Department is doing just that. Let's see, am I getting this right? I'm sorry, I skipped over this slide. This is a slide showing the relevance of and the variety of our holdings in the archives. Photographs, individual documents, broadsides, publications of all sorts, individual manuscript materials, and so on. Quite an impressive variety of material types, as well as the breadth and depth of the historical materials available there. Okay, the first initiative that I would like to share with you today involves the purpose statement of the Church History Department. Any institution like the Church History Department must define its work in terms of its core identity. That is, before answering the questions, what do we do and how do we do it, we must consider the question, why? Why does the church have a large-scale and multifaceted historical enterprise? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is rare, if not unique, among Christian religions regarding its level of commitment to record-keeping and history-making. Understanding the spiritual roots of this commitment will reveal the core purpose of the Church History Department. In an effort to answer the why question of church history, a few years ago, Department administration undertook an exhaustive study of the church's standard works, pursuing 3 general questions. Number 1, what are the commandments in modern revelations that define and direct the church's historical enterprise? Number 2, why are most of the church scriptures written in narrative form? And number 3, is there a theological connection between the gospel of Jesus Christ and the history of the church? In other words, is the church's interest in history more than simply heuristic value? Is there something fundamental about the relationship between the gospel and our historical initiatives? We discovered that as presented in the scriptures, history infuses the gospel with immediacy, relevance, and vitality. We synthesized the hundreds of scriptural passages into a short paragraph that serves now as the purpose statement of the Church History Department. And I'll read. As defined in the scriptures, a central purpose of history in the Church of Jesus Christ is to help God's children make and keep sacred covenants by 1, assuring remembrance of the great things of God, 2, helping to preserve the revealed order of the kingdom of God, and 3, witnessing to and defending the truth of the restoration in this dispensation. This statement defines 4 essential dimensions of the department's identity. First, it identifies its core work. It recognizes that the professional activities of acquiring, describing, preserving, providing access to, and interpreting historical records are various means to a spiritual end, but not those ends in themselves. By focusing on the spiritual objectives of our work, this purpose statement distinguishes the Church History Department from all other collecting institutions and aligns its work with the central mission of the Church. Secondly, this statement defines the ultimate spiritual impact or value of the work. The key verbs, remember, preserve, and witness, All have strong covenantal connotations as they are used in the Scriptures. Therefore, the scriptural concept of covenants unites and integrates these three objectives of church history into a lofty, gospel-centered value proposition. Thirdly, the statement identifies the primary beneficiaries of our work. The Church History Department will continue to serve scholarly and general audiences, but we recognize that its products and services will benefit most those from throughout the world who are interested in making and keeping sacred gospel covenants. Finally, the statement implies a strategy for doing department work. Helping God's children make and keep sacred covenants is a purpose that is shared by many organizations in the church. However, none of these organizations, including our own, is sufficient to accomplish this purpose all by itself. And the role of our department is unique. Of all of the church organizations, none focuses on the value of making covenants in terms of these three purposes, or these three objectives. Therefore, the Church History Department will best accomplish the larger scope of its purpose as it collaborates with essential partners. So the point here is that in the future, the Church History Department, its initiatives will be much more collaborative with partners inside and outside of church headquarters, inside and outside of the church as a whole, than it perhaps has been in the past. The second initiative is organizational structure. And I hope you don't go to sleep in my brief discussion about the formal organization of the Church History Department. In order to accomplish its ambitious purpose, the Church History Department needs to understand and serve a worldwide audience and to develop collections and related programs that reflect a rapidly expanding church. To this end, the department is now formally organized so that each division represents a core department function. Those of you who've been around the Church History Department for some time remember that our fundamental organization used to be Church Archives, Church History Library, Museum of Church History and Art, Special Collections, and other institutional emphases of our department. And now, in order to be more effective to a worldwide audience, we have organized functionally and tried to blur the boundaries of our functions that used to be really focused on the respective institutions. Does that make sense? So we're actually trying to we're organized in a way to be much more effective to a worldwide audience than we've been in the past. Now, some of these functions that you see here, and they're represented on those two lines, and they're really organized alphabetically, not in terms of their hierarchical importance. Each one of these divisions in our department is as valuable as the others. And some of these functions, like that of audience needs, have been organized for the first time. And just to let you know that we consider, we recognize that the formal organization is a wonderful servant but a terrible master. We are going to constantly adapt the organization to meet the maturing function of church history as it extends its influence to this much broader audience. Thirdly is the Church History Library. After more than 10 years of planning, ground was broken on October 11th, 2005 for the construction of a new 250,000 square foot church history library. That effectively triples the footprint of our current facility in the east wing of the church office building. Scheduled for completion in 2009, the facility, which is located on the southeast corner of Main Street and West Temple, just east of the Conference Center, will 1, house most of the department's documentary collections, and 2, serve as the public interface for most historical research purposes. It will have inviting spaces for patrons to research the history of the church, classrooms for presentations about church history, secure state-of-the-art storage areas to accommodate the growth and assure the preservation of relevant collections for the foreseeable future, and a variety of workspaces for employees and other staff. It is named, and this name is conscious, this name is Church History Library to signal a greater commitment by the department to serve the public in more effective and engaging ways in the future. Fourthly, planning and technology. In order to serve its worldwide audience in terms of a central purpose and with limited resources, the department must adopt new ways of doing its work more effectively and efficiently. Hence, for the first time, the department is creating a series of tools to focus our energies, track our productivity, report our progress, streamline our operations, and prepare for the future. Unless those sound to you like they're kind of bureaucratic impositions, the social scientists among you will recognize that if you want to have some kind of sustainable effort, there has to be some kind of formal organization to that effort. Otherwise, the effort dies with the retirement or the leaving of the key individuals. So what we're doing is creating an institution that is able to perpetuate, sustain these initiatives for the foreseeable future. And I'll just identify 5 of the major initiatives that we've done in this particular area, which includes a collections development plan, a project development process, performance measures, a marketing strategy, and manpower and succession planning, among others. Tools such as these will not do away with the need for creative and productive staff. Rather, they will allow the workforce to extend the influence of department work as never before. Fifthly, a mixed workforce. We recognize that our staff is the department's most valuable resource. At the same time, we recognize that regardless of its professionalism, the existing staff by itself cannot begin to accomplish the full extent of the work we have to do, even with the anticipated improvements in planning and technology. Thus, we are committed to the concept of a future workforce that includes more missionaries, interns, contractors, and temporary workers than ever before. Currently, church history missionaries contribute nearly 3/4 of the man-hours of our paid staff. This percentage will need to increase substantially if the department is to accomplish its worldwide purpose. Interestingly, this need for additional human resources is coming at a time when the most highly trained generation ever of Latter-day Saints is entering retirement, and when the first complete generation of technically savvy graduates is entering the job market. We must be better prepared to take advantage of this unprecedented opportunity. In conclusion, as I reflect on the history of the Church History Department, I recognize that each generation has contributed a degree of increased professionalism, which has produced larger, more useful, and more accessible collections. In the end, however, the most important question to ask of the church archives may not be, is it closed? Rather, I suggest a more central and challenging issue is whether the Church History Department is performing its divinely mandated mission. If it is, I sense that there will be historical records that are sufficient for the need, and opportunities to learn about and contemplate the things of God that are more than enough and to spare. I believe strongly that as we seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, we will be stretched beyond our natural capacities to accomplish His work to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. I trust that the openness of the archives will be a means to that end, but acknowledge that openness is not an end in itself. I'm pleased now to take any questions or comments that you might have. Oh, yes, the current staff will move to the new library as well. And we have, in the Church History Department, we have about 200 paid staff that we will continue to employ. In addition, and one of those tools that I'm not sure I mentioned, but it is implied, is workforce planning and succession planning. So that the interesting thing about that is that just like most baby boomers are getting ready for retirement. There's a surprising number of our employees who are nearing retirement age, and so we anticipate that there will be a succession of paid staff to inherit the church library. Here's a question. I'll just answer these as they come along if you can kind of stand a little bit of confusion. What duties would a church history missionary perform? We actually have quite a wide variety of functions that church history missionaries are performing, from conducting tours over in the Church History Museum to doing research on a variety of projects, including the Joseph Smith Papers Project, historic sites development projects, other publications, and other things. We have missionaries who are actually helping to catalog or process the new acquisitions as they come in, and a relatively new function that we're expanding quite substantially and anticipate that we'll have to do even more is what we might call a help desk, or a support network to answer questions from patrons outside of the department about where to find research or what kind of where to go to get information about church history. So a wide variety of great opportunities are available, particularly for those who have some training. And that's not to eliminate the possibility of people who may not have specialized historical or technical training, but we will have particular need of trained missionaries. And for those of you who are interested, come and contact me afterwards, and I have a number of business cards that I could share with you if you're interested. Oh, and here's a follow-up question to that. What about all the training that we're going to be needing to provide training and support and all that stuff for missionaries? And that's absolutely true. We've developed some training materials, fairly significant training materials for some of our major missionary forces, and developing other training materials, both pre-service and in-service training materials for other missionaries that will be serving in the department. Yeah, looks like it. Maybe we'll have to take some of these questions offline. The question says, how do you validate the collection of new documentation, and what active processes do you advance? And the tagline is, no more Mark Hoffmans. Touche, exactly. And as a matter of fact, our ability to identify forgeries and other kinds of illegitimate collection opportunities has increased over the years with advances in technology, and with the acknowledgement of a need to be more to scrutinize better collections as they come. Another issue that's not affecting the Mark Hoffman question is whether or not a donor has legal access or legal right to donate a collection to us. So there's a whole range of issues that we need to address as we consider the donation of an item, and increasingly we're being more sophisticated about that. Not to say that we were irresponsible in the past, but we're always improving in that area. What is stored in the Granite Mountain Record Vault in the Little Cottonwood Canyon? Most of the collections in the Granite Mountain Record Vault are original copies of microfilm. There are, Craig, help me, 2.5 million rolls, and these are the master rolls of microfilm of mostly family history records that have been acquired by the church since the 1930s. In addition to that, there are original copies of most of the church's publications, including scriptures, curriculum materials, and other publications stored there as a safeguard against a major catastrophe. That's mostly what's stored there. How old is the vaults? Early 1960s is when they were initially opened, and we're constantly upgrading and managing them so that they have a lifespan that goes into the future. We hear that there are archives or vaults in the office of the First Presidency. If true, what do the vaults contain? And I have to say that the rumors surrounding the First Presidency vault are vastly overblown. You know, the Urim Thummim, Sword of Laban, the 116 pages, none of that is true. There are some records that are of particular significance, but most of the items in the First Presidency vault were given specifically to the First Presidency, and they feel an obligation to keep them. And we have good working relationships with the First Presidency and the preservation and the documentation of those materials. Can't quite read that one. Is there a list of individuals who are denied access to the archives? No. If you can get into the church office building, you can get into the archives. And you could imagine that church security keeps a list of people who have expressed threat of one kind or another to the brethren or the church facilities, and therefore there's a heightened concern about granting unlimited access to them. But if the question is really addressing, do we let in people who have been excommunicated from the church or apostatized from the church or have published anti-Mormon materials, we don't make that distinction. If church security feels like somebody is a security risk, a physical security to the buildings or the brethren, then there may be a different approach to that. What grounds could someone be denied access to the library? Again, if they pose a threat to the holdings. If they've demonstrated, for example, that they've stolen materials from our collections, they might be denied access. But just because they're a so-called troublemaker from an ideological standpoint, they would not be denied access. In my opinion, okay, this is only my opinion, what is the most important document of the church archives? The manuscript, the portion of the manuscript of the Book of Mormon. That is singly the most important manuscript by far in the church archives. There are many other important collections, but that's the most important one. You mentioned classes in the new church history library. Will some of these classes be set up to recognize and discuss what are perceived to be some of the troublesome? We haven't programmed that aspect of our public program in the future yet, and so we anticipate that we will. What we really anticipate doing is providing resources that are not and information that are not accessible somewhere else. And so if BYU is offering classes, we will not duplicate those. If professional associations seem to be addressing certain issues on a consistent basis, we will probably not try to compete with them. But we will offer value that is generally not accessible through other venues. In David O. McKay, The Rise of Modern Mormonism, the book writers had access to minutes and records compiled by a secretary that were not normally accessible to a researcher on another subject. These writers kept the sacred and private things private. Do you foresee a time when, under certain conditions, certain researchers may, under certain review, have access to restricted materials? That's actually the case right now. And as I understand it, the co-authors of the book referenced did not access those materials in the church archives. Those materials were not in our holdings, and therefore there was a different standard of access to those materials. But the controlled access to certain restricted materials exists right now. Now we're going to have to address that a little bit more systematically and conclusively if we're able to put any of those materials online, because we would not violate those covenantal obligations of restricting access to sacred, private, and confidential materials. Do you think we'll ever see the publication of the First Presidency meeting minutes? I doubt it. Were there any problems of having a non-general authority as church historians such as Leonard Arrington? I think that question is better answered by referencing the Arrington journals at Utah State University and the other publications around that. We could have a whole session about that, and I think I'll not answer that, not because I don't have perspective on it, but because it's just too complicated. I think the short answer is yes. And there were some great advantages too. So, what if you managed the archives for King David and King Solomon? I'm not sure I could answer that hypothetical question. Let's take that offline. That would be extraordinary, though, wouldn't it? I'd rather manage the archives for Moroni and Nephi. Now that would be a job. If I wanted to research the history and text of the temple endowment, what criteria would be used to determine whether I'd be allowed access? I suspect you would not. We were discussing this matter with a couple of members of the Quorum of the 12, and they have said they don't even have access to those materials. So for academic purposes, not likely. Now there are records that are not sacred, private, or confidential regarding the origin of the endowment and the other temple ceremonies that a person could have access to, and much of that has been mined by earlier historians, so you could actually reference the secondary sources as well before seeking access to the primary sources. But those are not for academic discourse. Will the compilation of the history of the church be made available online? Well, I think there's an interest if this means what's known as the documentary history. We don't know yet because that is still copyrighted, but we anticipate the opportunity to put many records online, and we don't yet have a master plan for what our online resources are going to look like. But if those that are there, right now we have some pioneer databases of various kinds, and certainly a relatively modest but important website dealing with Joseph Smith. And if the interest in those sites is any indication, we need to provide a much greater exposure to relevant church holdings. Clint.
Just to clarify on that, in 2002, the manuscript history and the journal history were digitized and released on DVD through BYU, so those have been available to the public.
Yeah, and just to reference that larger DVD collection that Clint referenced, and that is, 2002? There were over 400,000 pages of manuscript material that were digitized and placed on DVD that are accessible in a number of libraries, including that at BYU. Is every document that is held by the archives identified in a catalog or list that is accessible to the public? Well, there are some, and this is by way of a little bit of confession, the short answer is no. Some of the materials that are restricted are not in the catalog, and other materials that have not yet been cataloged are not in the catalog, but we're trying to overcome that second problem. Are there any documents that are routinely denied to the public, and if so, what are the documents? Well, I think I referenced that in the text. Are there any smoking guns in the archives? Well, smoking guns in terms of, did Brigham Young order the Mountain Meadows Massacre? Did Joseph Smith make up the Book of Mormon? If what you mean is by smoking gun, is there anything that proves the church false? I think that's a matter of interpretation, but from my perspective, on the contrary. The holdings of the church archives, even those that represent an anti-Mormon point of view, are surprisingly supportive of all aspects of the church, even though they recognize the weakness of individuals and, in some cases, the difficulties of issues that the church has faced. Some people anticipated that the McClellan journals were going to be that smoking gun and were sorely disappointed. How does the Church History Department and Library impact, if at all, the development of general church curriculum. Well, those of you who have been following the development, the curriculum materials that are used in Priesthood and Relief Society know that they've been focusing on the teachings of the living prophets. And our office has been working very closely with the curriculum materials in the development of the contents of those particular series. We also anticipate that there will be a much greater closer collaborative effort between us and curriculum in the future. Where is the new library? The northeast corner of Main Street, is that right? Main Street and North Temple, just east of the conference center. Okay? It's if you can just imagine your favorite parking lot at church headquarters, it's not there anymore. And there's a bunch of steel beams going up into place. You know, that's really an interesting and somewhat difficult question. Because of security purposes, we have felt that underground parking at the church history library was not consistent with the security of the collections. Thinking about the Mura building in Oklahoma City. There are parking lots available, but you might get a little exercise coming there. And that's been a huge problem that the church is facing with all of its development. What I'd recommend is they actually use tracks to get there. Tracks is going to become increasingly a better access point than the parking lots available. And while the two malls are being constructed, parking is of a real premium. So, you know, bear with us for the next few years. There are a couple of questions that ask about access to specific records, and I think I'd rather address those offline than online, because we could be here for a long time dealing with individual issues. Where are the most precious items of church history stored? Are they in a vault or in a mountain? The answer is yes. I referenced the vault of the First Presidency in the administration building. That holds some very valuable records. The most valuable archival materials are stored currently in a vault in the east wing of the church office building, and there will be equally secure facilities, but larger and more protected facilities over in the new building that I just referenced. And then there's a vault over in the church museum as well for quite important artifactual and art materials. If you are the associate managing director, is one of the brethren the managing director? No, the formal organization of the historical department is that Elder Marlon K. Jensen serves as the executive director of the family and church history department. And then he has 3 other executive directors who are also members of the 70 that serve with him. Elder Gary Coleman, Elder Whitney Clayton, and Elder Sheldon Child. And then Richard Turley is the managing director of the family and church history department. So he manages the entire department, and then I am the associate managing director on the church history side, and another man by the name of Jay Verkler is the associate managing director on the family history side. And if you can follow that, you're a good business consultant. Could you comment on recent research indicating the church members want to be told the history and their history undiluted and unsanitized? Well, the interesting thing is the newspaper didn't. They told the truth, but not the whole truth, if I could put it that way. And the whole truth is this: in doing, I mentioned that we had an audience needs division of our department, and we've been conducting certain audience research, focus groups and audience surveys, asking a whole lot of opinion questions about church history. And one of the things that came back, along with a whole bunch of other information that helps us understand how best to serve our audience, was the perception that that for the history of the church to be true, it didn't have to be without blemishes. And that many members of the church actually appreciated understanding that the church has faced issues in its history, and that individual church leaders and other noteworthy individuals had weaknesses like all of us. And so while they appreciated, and here's the part that the newspaper didn't get exactly, I won't say straight, but they didn't include all of these details. The surveyors that the members that we surveyed said, we don't want all of the warts on the history of the church, as it were, to be part of the Sunday school curriculum. We want the Sunday school curriculum to be as faithful and pure as it always has been. Nevertheless, we can appreciate a much more complex and nuanced church history than we have gotten in the past. And that's a very important finding, and one that we'll use hopefully to our advantage in designing programs for the future. Time for a couple more? Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. What unique items in the church history archives strengthen your testimony the most? I have to say, let me just give you one little for instance, and this kind of typifies many. In the manuscript of the Book of Mormon, there is a page that includes 1 Nephi chapter 3, verse 7. You know that famous quote from Nephi, I will go and do the things which the Lord hath commanded, etc., etc. Well, the interesting thing about that is that in that sentence, in the middle of the sentence, the handwriting changes, indicating that one scribe led to the stopping of the dictation in mid-sentence, and then another scribe picked it up sometime later, and it just continued on with no editorial adjustments or anything like that. I mean, that is just really quite a remarkable example of one of the characteristics of Joseph's translating the Book of Mormon. But there are many others. I mean, again, we could be here all day talking about the faith-promoting materials in the archives. This is a conference about defending the faith. Could you elaborate more about the scriptural basis of the archives' mandate to witness and defend the truth of the restoration? Again, I've given a number of speeches at MHA and at other conferences about this, and the full text of those may be available, in those other databases and so on. But let me just say this about that in a general way, because again, we're nearing the end. It seems to me that one of the fundamental premises of the historical department of the church is that it is consistent, that it is part of the restoration of the gospel in the latter days. In other words, I won't say the gospel would be less true, but we would be able to appreciate the gospel less if somehow we didn't see it as an experience as well as a set of doctrines. And let me just elaborate with two questions. What if somehow we discovered that the Book of Mormon text was produced not by translation using the gift and power of God, but by some means that you've read the articles that say, Joseph Smith did it himself in some kind of extraordinary fashion, deep psychology or some kind of trance or whatever it might be. What if we discovered that those claims were in fact true? But it didn't change a single word in the Book of Mormon. In other words, the doctrine was all the same. Would that change anything? It would change everything. What if we discovered that everything that Joseph Smith learned in the grove, in the sacred grove on that spring morning of 1820, he had really discovered by means of a sensitive reading of the Bible and contemplation of the logic of the Christian creed? In other words, all the doctrine was the same, but none of the experience was the same. Would that change anything? Yeah, it would change everything. It's the distinction between a Reformationist church and a Restorationist church. And our claim, our fundamental truth claim, is that we are a restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ in the latter days. And therefore, the history of the church and the doctrine of the church must be considered hand in glove. Ultimately, the truth claims of Mormonism cannot be distinguished from the history of the church. I have more to say about that. You can tell, can't you? I've got a little energy behind that point. How do we get the right to publish a picture from the church art collection? There's an intellectual property office of the church that you would go through to get, and there's a procedure to go through. So contact the church in the intellectual property office. I probably ought to end. Anyway, I've got a few more other questions if you want to contact me afterwards, and then I also have some cards if you'd like to contact me later. Thank you.